Getting lost in the desert is a death sentence. No roads, no signs, just endless sand in every direction. But somehow, the ancient Egyptians always found their way home. So how did they do it? From dunes that whispered direction to the ability to literally smell their way back, here are 20 incredible ways the Egyptians always found their way home in the desert. Compass beetles. Imagine being lost in the vast Egyptian desert at night, with no landmarks, no guides, and only an endless stretch of sand in every direction. Now imagine that the answer to finding your way home was crawling right beneath your feet. The ancient Egyptians mastered the art of navigation, but some of their most unexpected guides weren't the stars, the sun, or the wind, but beetles. Certain species of scarab beetles had an unusual ability to move in straight lines across the vast sands, using the Milky Way itself as a guide. While the Egyptians may not have understood the exact science behind this, they noticed that these insects never wandered aimlessly, and that made them invaluable for navigation. The sacred dung beetle, Scarabia sacra, linked to the god Khepri, was observed rolling balls of dung in perfectly straight lines, even under moonlight. Modern researchers have since confirmed that these beetles use celestial cues to maintain direction, one of the few creatures on Earth known to do so. Egyptian traders and desert travelers, who often moved under the cover of night to escape the searing heat, likely recognized this behavior. If an insect could follow the stars with such precision, then humans could do the same. The scarab's symbolic connection to rebirth, order, and cosmic balance suggests that its movement may have influenced Egyptian navigation techniques. Often carved into tomb walls and royal artifacts, the scarab wasn't just a spiritual symbol. It represented one of the earliest lessons in following the stars home. Egyptian caravan leaders and military scouts in Nubia and Sinai studied these beetles and used their natural pathfinding as further confirmation that they were headed in the right direction. Even today, scientists study this method of celestial navigation. Research on beetle movement under starlight has influenced modern advancements in robotic space exploration. Bird migrations. Egyptians were keen observers of nature, and one of their most effective methods of finding their way home involved watching the bird. Certain bird species instinctively migrated toward the Nile, making them natural navigation markers for travelers lost in the desert. One of the most well-documented migratory birds in ancient Egypt was the white stork, Ciconia ciconia. Every year, thousands of these birds flew north from Africa, heading straight for the fertile lands surrounding the Nile. Egyptian traders and soldiers quickly learned that by following their flight paths, they could find their way back to water and civilization. Even in religious and artistic depictions, birds were recognized for their symbolic and practical role in navigation. The Egyptian god Bennu, often linked to the Greek phoenix, was believed to represent renewal and guidance, much like the real migratory birds that helped guide travelers home. The Temple of Edfu, dedicated to Horus, features inscriptions describing how birds were seen as divine messengers, leading the way through the land. Some historical accounts suggest that Pharaoh Thutmose III, known for his military campaigns, used knowledge of bird migrations when leading expeditions into the Sinai and Nubia. Soldiers stationed in fortresses like Buhen, near the Second Cataract, watched for birds flying inland, confirming their proximity to the Nile or desert waterholes. Even Egyptian fishermen and river traders took advantage of bird behavior. They noted that certain species always circled above water sources before landing, offering another clue about where lakes, wells, or even underground streams might be located. Tracking the stars. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the stars, and for good reason. In a land where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, knowing how to navigate under the night sky was a matter of survival. Unlike modern travelers who rely on compasses or GPS, Egyptian traders, soldiers, and priests used the heavens as their guide. One of their most trusted celestial markers is Sirius, known as Sopdet. More than just a bright star, it was the most sacred object in the sky. Its first appearance at dawn each year marked the flooding of the Nile, a moment so crucial that the Egyptian calendar itself was based on. Travelers from Thebes, Abydos, and Aswan used Sirius as a reference, knowing it always rose in the east. As long as they could see it, they were never lost. For journeys deep into the desert, Egyptians relied on constellation. Orion, which they linked to Osiris, god of the afterlife, was particularly significant. The 3 stars in Orion's belt created a perfect alignment for determining east and west. Another important guide was the Big Dipper, called the Bull's Thigh, which circled the North Celestial Pole, helping Egyptians fix their position at night. This knowledge wasn't just for merchants and nomads, it was carefully studied by high priests and royal astronomers. Imhotep, the legendary architect of Djoser's Step Pyramid, was one of Egypt's earliest recorded stargazers, and later, under Pharaoh Amenhotep III, astronomers mapped star positions onto temple walls. The pyramid texts, carved in tombs like those of Pharaoh Unas, recorded how the stars guided both souls and the living. Echoes in the desert, using sound to navigate. The ancient Egyptians understood the power of sound, especially in the open desert, where vast landscapes could be eerily silent. Experienced travellers, soldiers and traders knew that echoes could reveal hidden landmarks, cliffs, valleys, or even distant settlements. This method was particularly useful in areas where visual cues were limited, such as when sandstorms reduced visibility, or when navigating rocky desert regions. When reaching an unfamiliar area, travellers would shout, clap, or strike objects together, listening carefully for how the sound bounced back. A quick echo indicated that a nearby rock face or canyon was present, while a delayed or faint echo suggested open, empty land ahead. Ancient military scouts used echoes strategically during their desert patrols. Pharaoh Seti I, known for his military campaigns, led Egyptian forces into Sinai and Libya, where his soldiers were trained to use echoes to detect narrow mountain passes or enemy movements. By gauging how sound travelled in an area, they could identify paths leading to hidden valleys or shelter, critical for long marches. Even desert priests and builders used this method when choosing temple locations. The Temple of Hathor at Serabit el-Qadim, located in the Sinai Peninsula, was constructed in a rocky desert region where sound carried far. Some historians suggest that priests used echoes to determine the best place to build, ensuring that their voices would resonate impressively during rituals. Following the sun's path. The sun was one of the most reliable navigational tools for the ancient Egyptians. As it moved across the sky from east to west, travellers could use its position to determine their direction, ensuring they never strayed too far from civilization. This method was particularly crucial for merchants, messengers, and military expeditions, crossing the vast desert between trade cities like Memphis, Thebes, and the Red Sea ports. One of the best documented examples of sun navigation comes from the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, who sent an expedition to the land of Punt. Egyptian sailors relied on the sun's rising position to maintain their course when venturing into unfamiliar waters. But on land, desert travellers followed a similar principle, tracking the sun's arc to confirm their direction. A simple but effective trick was measuring shadows. At sunrise, shadows stretch westward, while at sunset, they point eastward. By observing the changing length and direction of shadows, Egyptian traders and soldiers could maintain a steady course through the desert. High priests and scholars at Heliopolis, the city of the sun, recorded solar movements, refining these techniques for generations of explorers. This method was so ingrained in Egyptian culture that it influenced temple architecture. Structures like the Karnak temple complex were carefully aligned with the sun's movements, emphasizing the east-west axis. The famous Great Temple of Abu Simbel, built by Ramses II, was designed so that on specific days, the sunlight would illuminate its inner sanctum, wind patterns, and sand dunes. The prevailing winds in Egypt generally blew from the northwest, shaping sand dunes in predictable patterns. By carefully studying these formations, traders, military expeditions, and nomadic travelers could determine their direction without needing stars or the sun. One of the most famous Egyptian routes where this technique was used was the Darb el-Arbam, or the 40 Days Road, a key trade route connecting the Nile Valley to Nubia. Merchants travelling through the harsh Sahara needed to recognise dune shapes. Crescent-shaped Barshan dunes, for example, always formed with their open side facing the wind's direction, meaning that the closed side pointed where the wind had come from. By tracking these natural markers, Egyptian caravan leaders could confirm whether they were still heading in the right direction. Even Egypt's military commanders relied on wind knowledge. In the Middle Kingdom, Pharaoh Senusret III led campaigns into Nubia, ensuring that his armies could navigate back to Egyptian territory using the same wind-shaped dunes that guided merchants. Wind direction was also critical when deciding where to set up fortresses and supply stations in the desert. Settlements were often built near sheltered areas where dunes provided a natural windbreak. Water memory. For the Egyptians, water was everything. In the desert, the difference between life and death depended on knowing where to find it. Caravan leaders, traders, and messengers had no maps or signposts, but they didn't need them. They memorized the exact locations of wells, oases, and underground springs, creating an invisible map in their mind. One of the most vital water sources was the Dakhla Oasis, deep in the western desert. Travelers crossing from Abydos to the Libyan frontier relied on it as a key stopping point. Egyptian caravans traveling from Memphis to the Red Sea also depended on wells dug along their routes, sometimes marking them with stone pillars or symbols for future travelers. Large rock formations, clusters of palm trees, or changes in soil color could indicate the presence of underground water. Egyptian desert scouts, trained from a young age, learned to identify these subtle clues. They also knew that certain plants, like the tamarisk and acacia, only grew where water was near the surface. Pharaohs even invested in securing reliable water access for travelers. Ramses II, one of Egypt's most powerful rulers, ordered the digging of new wells along desert roads leading to turquoise mines in Sinai. This ensured that workers and soldiers had enough water while travelling through some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Animal instincts. The ancient Egyptians relied on animals for survival, not just as beasts of burden, but also as natural navigators. One of the most valuable animals in desert travel was the camel, an animal so well adapted to the harsh conditions that it could sense hidden water sources better than any human. Egyptian traders, soldiers, and nomads knew this. And instead of always leading their camels, they sometimes let the camels lead them. Though camels were not native to Egypt in the earliest dynasties, they became widely used during the late period, Beyek 604 to 332 BCE, when trade routes expanded deep into the desert. These animals had an incredible ability to detect moisture from miles away. Their keen sense of smell allowed them to pick up the scent of underground water, while their instinct to seek out cooler, shaded areas often led directly to an oasis or a well. Egyptian merchants travelling from Thebes to the Red Sea ports often trusted camels to find the next water stop. If a caravan found itself uncertain of the route, a common technique was to let the camels roam freely. Given enough time, the animals would naturally wander toward water, making them living compasses in the vast desert. Even in military campaigns, Egyptian generals recognized the importance of camels in desert navigation. During conflicts with Nubian and Libyan forces, armies needed to ensure a steady supply of water while on the move. Soldiers were trained to observe the behavior of their camels, recognizing signs that indicated nearby wells or an oasis. In some cases, captured camels from desert tribes were used because they were already familiar with water sources unknown to the Egyptian army. The smell of home. The ancient Egyptians had an incredible sense of their surroundings, and one of the most overlooked but reliable ways to find their way home was through scent. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, carried a distinct smell of moisture, vegetation, and damp earth, which experienced travellers could recognise long before they saw it. This method was particularly important for traders, farmers, and desert dwellers who travelled far from the river. The Egyptian desert could be an overwhelmingly dry environment, but as one approached the Nile Valley, the air subtly changed. Humidity increased, the scent of wet soil and papyrus plants became stronger, and travellers could sense they were nearing home, even in complete darkness. Egyptian caravan leaders from cities like Abydos and Edfu relied on this natural phenomenon. Merchants returning from Red Sea trade routes or Nubian gold mines would take note of the air's moisture and scent as they neared the Nile. Some experienced travellers even claimed they could differentiate specific regions based on how the river smelled. Priests and temple builders also recognized the power of scent in navigation and rituals. The Temple of Karnak in Thebes, one of the most significant religious centers in Egypt, was close enough to the Nile that its courtyards and halls would have been infused with the river's presence. Pilgrims arriving from the desert might have first noticed the temple through their noses before their eyes, as the scent of the Nile and burning incense merged into a signal that they were approaching a sacred place. Colour of the sand. While the desert could appear like an endless sea of dunes, trained travellers understood that subtle variations in sand colour could indicate proximity to water, fertile land, or civilization. The Nile's floodplain, for example, had darker, richer soil due to the annual deposits of silt. This was in stark contrast to the lighter, golden sands of the open desert. Caravan leaders travelling from Thebes to Dakhla Oasis knew that as the sand gradually darkened, they were approaching riverbanks or water sources. These colour shifts, though subtle to an untrained eye, were critical for survival. Beyond just the Nile, trade routes connecting Memphis to the Sinai Peninsula passed through areas where red, yellow and brown hues signalled different types of terrain. The presence of reddish sand often meant iron-rich soil, which was common in regions closer to mining areas. Egyptian gold miners in Nubia used this knowledge to identify locations where minerals might be found, but it also helped them avoid getting lost in featureless landscapes. Pharaoh Ramses III, who led several military campaigns into the Libyan desert, likely relied on experienced scouts who could read these changes in the land. The military expeditions of the New Kingdom depended on precise navigation to avoid straying too far into barren regions, where resources were scarce. Shadow lengths. The ancient Egyptians were experts in timekeeping, and they applied the same knowledge to navigation using shadows. By simply measuring the length and angle of their shadows throughout the day, travellers could determine their direction and ensure they stayed on course. This technique was especially useful in vast open deserts, where no landmarks were visible. The basic principle was simple. In the morning, shadows stretch westward as the sun rises in the east. At noon, when the sun is at its highest point, shadows are shortest. In the afternoon, shadows point eastward as the sun moves toward the west. This provided an easy way for Egyptians to estimate direction without any instruments. All they needed was their own shadow. High-ranking officials and priests who were responsible for tracking celestial movements understood this concept well. The city of Heliopolis, known as the City of the Sun, was the center of solar observation in ancient Egypt. Scholars there studied the movement of the sun and how shadows behaved at different times of the year, allowing them to refine their understanding of navigation. The same principle was used by Egyptian surveyors and builders. Temples like Abu Simbel and Karnak were aligned with the sun's path, and workers likely used shadow measurements to help position these massive structures correctly. This level of precision extended beyond construction. Military forces under Pharaoh Thutmose III used shadow-based navigation when marching through Sinai and Nubia, ensuring that they stayed on the correct route. Egyptians also applied this knowledge to early timekeeping devices such as shadow sticks and obelisks, which functioned like massive sundials. This method was so reliable that it is still used by desert survivalists today as a backup for compass navigation. Sacred landmarks. The ancient Egyptians built some of the most recognizable structures in history, and they didn't just serve religious or political purposes. They were also crucial navigation tools. In an age without maps or compasses, towering pyramids, temples, and obelisks acted as waypoints for travelers, ensuring they could find their way home. The most obvious example is the Great Pyramid of Giza, which stood at 146.6 meters, 481 feet, when it was completed around 2560 BCE. This massive structure could be seen from miles away, serving as a fixed reference point for traders, soldiers, and desert travelers. Merchants moving along the caravan routes between Memphis and the Fayum Oasis could use it to confirm their direction. Beyond pyramids, temples were also strategically positioned to aid in navigation. The Temple of Karnak in Thebes and the Temple of Luxor were not only religious centers, but also prominent structures visible across the desert landscape. The Temple of Abu Simbel, built by Ramses II, was designed to face the sun, making it an ideal landmark for anyone traveling along the Nubian trade route. Obelisks, which were tall stone monuments carved with hieroglyphs, also played a role in guiding travelers. Some, like those erected in Heliopolis, were positioned near important roads and city entrances. Because they were often gilded with electrum, a gold and silver alloy, they would catch the sunlight, making them even easier to spot from great distances. Marked trails with stones. While Egypt's grand monuments served as large-scale waypoints, travellers also used a simpler but highly effective technique, marking trails with small rock piles. Egyptians moving along trade routes often left carefully placed stones at key locations to signal the correct path. This was particularly useful when crossing open desert areas where the wind could erase footprints in a matter of hours. Merchants travelling between Thebes and the Red Sea ports would leave stacked stones at crossroads, ensuring that the next group of travellers could follow the safest route. These stacked stone markers, known today as cairns, varied in size. A small pile might indicate a general direction, while a larger, more structured stack might signal an important landmark, such as a well or an oasis. Some markers even had hieroglyphs carved into them, providing additional information about the path ahead. Military campaigns also took advantage of this technique. Ramses II's army, during its march to Kadesh, used stone markers to guide troops across unfamiliar terrain. Egyptian soldiers likely built temporary cairns to mark the safest routes back to their supply bases. Without these markers, entire battalions could become disoriented in the shifting sands. Even in religious journeys, these markers played a role. Pilgrims travelling to the Siwa Oasis, home to the famous Oracle of Amun, would use stone piles to guide them along the journey. Since Siwa was deep in the desert, a single wrong turn could mean never making it back. Sunlight reflections on metal or water. With no modern roads or signs, travellers relied on natural and man-made reflections to guide their way. Whether it was the glistening rooftops of temples, the shimmering waters of the Nile, or polished metal surfaces catching the sun, reflections became a crucial tool for those finding their way home. One of the most striking examples was the use of gold-capped temples and obelisks. Many of Egypt's grandest structures, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, were originally topped with gold or electrum, a precious alloy of gold and silver. These materials were chosen not only for their religious significance, but also because they could be seen from great distances when sunlight hit them. A traveller crossing the desert from Abydos or Memphis could spot these reflections, giving them a clear point of reference even from miles away. The Nile itself was another major reflective surface. Egyptian traders who journeyed into the desert often relied on the sun's glint off distant water to reorient themselves. Those travelling west toward the Siwa Oasis or east toward the Red Sea would scan the horizon for sudden flashes of light, which often indicated the presence of water. This was especially useful when returning home, as the brighter, wetter air around the Nile could create shimmering mirages that pointed the way back. Historical records also suggest that Pharaoh Seti I, during his desert campaigns in Canaan and Libya, used polished bronze shields to send signals across the battlefield. Familiar heat changes. One of the most effective ways to determine the proximity of water was through temperature shifts. The air near wells, oases, and the Nile was noticeably cooler, and those who understood these subtle variations could find their way home without needing any landmarks at all. The ancient Egyptians knew that water absorbs and retains heat differently than sand or rock. During the day, dry desert terrain would radiate intense heat, while areas near water sources, especially lush oases like Bahariya or Dakhla, would be noticeably cooler. Travellers returning from long journeys south to Nubia often reported that they could feel when they were getting close to the Nile, even before they could see it. This knowledge was particularly valuable for dessert merchants and military expeditions. Egyptian traders travelling between Memphis and the Sinai Peninsula were skilled in recognising temperature shifts caused by hidden underground water sources. These cooling effects, combined with changes in wind patterns, often meant an oasis was nearby. Pharaoh Thutmose III's army, which conducted extensive campaigns in the Levant and Nubia, relied on these natural cues to navigate harsh environments. Even Egyptian nomads and herders used this method. Many Bedouin descendants in North Africa today still practice the same technique, noting that cold air collects in low-lying areas where water is present. They also recognise that areas with consistent evening breezes tend to be closer to water sources, using fire and smoke signals. When visibility was low or travellers were too far from known landmarks, they used fire and smoke signals to communicate over long distances. One of the most common uses of fire signals was by night travellers in the desert. A well-placed campfire could be seen from miles away, acting as a beacon for returning merchants or soldiers. In strategic locations near trade routes, some outposts and watchtowers built by Egyptian military forces would light fires at night, guiding those navigating back towards safety. This was particularly important along the eastern desert routes leading to the Red Sea, or across the western desert toward oases like Karga or Siwa. Smoke signals were equally valuable during the day. Egyptian scouts and messengers used controlled plumes of smoke to indicate locations of water sources, encampments, or potential dangers. The effectiveness of fire and smoke wasn't just limited to military or trade expeditions. Desert priests and temple guardians stationed at sacred sites like the Oracle of Amun at Siwa or the Temple of Hathor at Serebit el-Qadim also used ritual fires to signal approaching travellers, ensuring they found their way to these remote spiritual centres. Listening for drums or animal sounds. In the vast, empty Egyptian desert, travellers often couldn't rely on sight alone. Instead, they trained their ears to listen for distant human activity, using sound to guide them home. Drums were particularly significant in ancient Egyptian ceremonies and communication. Many settlements and religious temples used drums to mark time, signal important events, or communicate over distances. Travellers returning from long trade journeys or military expeditions would often pause to listen for rhythmic drumming, a sign that they were approaching a city, temple, or resting place. One of the best documented examples of drumming in Egyptian history comes from festival processions and temple rituals. The Great Temple of Karnak in Thebes was known for ceremonial drum performances that could be heard far beyond the city. Traders or pilgrims heading toward the Valley of the Kings or the Temple of Luxor might have followed the distant echoes of these sacred rhythms, using them as an invisible guide through the desert. Beyond human-made sounds, Egyptians also listened for animal noises to locate settlements or water sources. The sounds of cattle, goats, or donkeys meant that fresh water and human habitation were nearby. Nomadic herders, especially those travelling between Fayum, the oases, and the Nile Valley, knew that certain animals would only roam in areas close to wells or riverbanks. Military expeditions also relied on sound-based navigation. Pharaoh Seti I's desert scouts, for instance, were trained to listen for the distant echoes of camel caravans, helping them locate supply routes in the barren landscape. Similarly, Egyptian fortresses in Nubia and the Sinai were positioned near known water sources and trade paths, where the noises of approaching merchants or livestock helped guards prepare for incoming travellers. Magnetized iron tools. While compasses as we know them didn't exist yet, some Egyptian traders and craftsmen may have accidentally discovered magnetism while handling iron-rich tools. This could have provided them with an early understanding of directional forces, even if they didn't yet have a practical magnetic compass. Iron was not widely used in early Egyptian history, but by the New Kingdom, Thars 1550 to 1070 BCE, there is evidence of iron tools and weapons. Some of these may have contained naturally magnetic iron ore, known as magnetite. It's possible that traders noticed how some iron objects aligned themselves in a specific direction when left undisturbed, subtly pointing toward the Earth's poles. The Egyptians had access to meteorite iron, called iron from the sky, which was considered sacred. This metal, often containing high amounts of nickel, was used in ceremonial blades and jewelry, such as the famous dagger of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Some of these meteorite fragments may have had slight magnetic properties, leading ancient craftsmen to notice their directional tendencies. Egyptian traders who travelled to the iron-rich regions of Nubia and the eastern desert may have encountered naturally occurring lodestone, a magnetic mineral that was known in the ancient world. If they noticed that small iron tools or lodestones always settled in the same direction, they could have used this as a rudimentary guide, aligning themselves with the invisible forces of the earth. Military leaders such as Thutmose III, who led campaigns deep into the Levant, benefited from such discoveries. His engineers and tacticians, responsible for ensuring the army remained on course, experimented with these magnetic properties when charting strategic routes through unfamiliar terrain. Secret symbols on rock faces. Travellers, traders and military scouts carved secret symbols into rock faces, marking paths, water sources and potential dangers for those who followed. These subtle signs became an early form of wayfinding, guiding Egyptians home through some of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. One of the best examples of this technique comes from the Western Desert and the Sinai Peninsula, where explorers have discovered hieroglyphs and pictograms carved into cliffs and boulders. Some of these markings indicated safe routes through treacherous terrain, while others warned of bandits, dangerous wildlife, or impassable roads ahead. The Egyptians, who mined turquoise and copper in the Sinai, for instance, left markings near caves and wells, ensuring that future expeditions would know where to find shelter and water. Desert travellers moving between Thebes and the oases of the Libyan desert also relied on these markings. Some signs pointed toward known caravan routes, while others marked locations of hidden wells that only a few trusted guides knew about. These symbols were likely used by military scouts during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, who led multiple campaigns into Canaan and Libya. His soldiers, needing to navigate vast and unfamiliar terrain, relied on symbols left by earlier patrols to avoid getting lost. Some of these markings have survived for thousands of years, still visible on ancient trade routes and temple walls. Reading the night's temperature drop. As the sun set over the desert, experienced travellers could detect subtle shifts in heat, using them as a guide to locate water sources, settlements, or even the direction of the Nile. This technique was particularly useful for night travel, when navigating by landmarks became much more difficult. During the day, the desert absorbed intense heat, but not all areas cooled at the same rate. Sand, for example, released heat quickly, making it one of the coldest surfaces at night. However, areas near water sources, underground springs or vegetation retained warmth for much longer. Egyptian traders and desert scouts knew that if they encountered patches of land that remained warmer after sunset, it often meant that water was nearby. This technique was commonly used by caravan leaders travelling between Memphis and the Dakhla oasis. After the sunset, they would walk barefoot or place their hands on the ground, feeling for temperature differences that could lead them toward wells or rivers. In some cases, they would also observe how cold air settled in certain valleys, as these depressions often contained moisture or even underground springs. The Egyptian military also relied on this method as well. Pharaoh Thutmose III, known for his strategic conquests, led his army through deserts to expand Egypt's empire. His scouts monitored how different surfaces cooled at night, ensuring that the troops were headed toward habitable areas instead of barren wastelands. Even today, modern survivalists and desert guides use this technique. Scientists have found that thermal imaging technology, which detects temperature differences in terrain, is being used to map ancient Egyptian settlements and lost rivers buried beneath the sand. The very method that Egyptians used to find their way home is now helping uncover their hidden past.